If you have finished part 4 of Netflix's Disenchantment, then stay tuned as I theorize on the freaky puppet Freckles. Hey guys, you have McGann, and this is the Fangirl, where today I am delving into my nightmares by digging deeper into the puppet Freckles, who is suddenly a real boy, and a real troublesome pain in the rear, too. But first, I do need to boast that I was right! I did a video on who Elfo's mother was, and heck yes, I'd say that's a victory for my powers to brain good. And I'm still holding out hope that Bean and the whole Og dynasty curse is related to a mermaid origin story. If you want to hear more about that theory, check out my other video. It's really not as crazy as it sounds at first, so, watch it, give it a chance, and then let me know what you think. Now, before I jump into part 4 of Disenchantment and go into the new Freckles stuff, let's start with our origin of Freckles, at least as far as we know. He is visible in the very first episode. We can see Freckles sitting in the window of the ventriloquist shop front and center, which I think is very interesting because if you go back and watch the first episode of Futurama, look, you can see Nibbler's shadow right before Fry gets frozen. And that reveal with Nibbler being involved isn't even addressed until several seasons later. So we do have some precedence here that Matt Groening, Gearing? I can never say that right. But Matt, who made The Simpsons, likes to hide things in plain sight that will be significant later. So what we've seen of Freckles so far probably will not match what his final story arc is going to be. And hey, even when Nibbler first came into Futurama, we all originally thought that he was some creature with this cat-like level of intelligence. And not too differently, when Freckles is formally introduced at the end of part 3, we see him as just a toy. It comes off like King Zog is using the puppet to disassociate his mind from his trauma, kind of like what Mel Gibson did with his character in The Beaver, which is a really interesting movie if you haven't seen that one yet. So when Zog gets Freckles, Freckles has a higher-pitched version of Zog's voice, and we clearly see Zog's lips moving. So this looks like the start of Jeff Dunham's career, nothing nefarious, right? Well, then the shopkeeper surfaces, and it's clearly Dagmar who's dressed down. Oddly, her own family members do not recognize her face or her voice, but that's an issue for another day. I'd like to say that it was cartoon logic, but come on, this series is a little bit too smart to expect the audience to be that dumb. So I hope that that is something that they eventually address in a future season, but I'm not going to hold my breath too much. It's probably just a plot hole. I guess Dagmar did have part of her face in shadow from her hood, so maybe that's why they couldn't tell, but come on, that was definitely her voice. And I even tried to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, well, maybe that's not Dagmar, maybe that's her sister Becky, because they sound really similar, but when you look at their noses, yeah, that's 100% Dagmar selling that doll. And it does make sense, because in part 4 of Disenchantment, Dagmar comes up to the surface and she's like, oh, I've manipulated every tiny detail to make this moment happen. Which means we have to consider, why would Dagmar want this useless lump of wood in Zog's hands unless there was something more sinister to it? And if you watch Freckles in part 3 of the series, you see that Zog is very attached to the toy very quickly. And even when Bean takes Freckles and hides him, Zog inexplicably finds him again. But because we always see Zog's lips moving, we don't really think a whole lot about it. Especially not when Zog, through Freckles, explains that he feels like he's going crazy and needs to go away. And that moment is what gets Bean to send Zog to the Twinkletown insane asylum. So what if Zog was never controlling Freckles? What if Freckles was the one who was puppeting Zog? And I mean, think about it, who benefits from getting Zog out of the way? What we know in part 4 is that the wedding in Hell required the King of Hell and the Queen of Dreamland. Princess Bean would not fit the bill. She needed to be Queen Tiabeanie for the repayment to Hell to be valid. So Dagmar sold an enchanted puppet with the express purpose of getting Zog off the throne and Bean onto it. And even with Prince Derek outranking Bean, I mean, 1, he left town, and 2, he's only 14, he couldn't have taken over anyways. So no matter what happened at that moment, Bean would have been the person that Dreamland had to default to. Now, Freckles himself itself really does make an interesting tool when you're playing Game of Thrones. But Part 4 Freckles is so unsettling. In that season, it's not only proven that Freckles is sentient and alive, but that other characters can transfer their consciousnesses into puppets as well. Mommy no likey. So first, Freckles comes alive and he's shown to have the ability to manipulate people's dreams. And then we see Cloyd and Becky grabbing puppets and then somehow operating them as well. Now, I assume that Cloyd and Becky can turn back at any given time because they transferred themselves into the dolls without any hesitation. But, that all opens up the question, who is in Freckles? By the end of Part 4, we see that Freckles is a free agent, and he's selling off Derek and Jasper to the freak show, as well as getting caught up in a cage himself. So clearly, Freckles has a part to play in future seasons, but, I mean, the way the series goes, it's hard to say. We might get to Part 5, and everyone breaks out of the freak show, and Freckles gets ripped into bits. Boom, end of creepy puppet. I kinda doubt that option, though. Looking at Freckles and his features, I have this strange feeling that he's part of the Og dynasty. I mean, come on, everybody else who has those pointy little hair spikes has been part of the Og family so far. And both Yog and his father, how do you even say that? Zog? It still sounds like Zog, but it's with an X instead of a Z. But both of them had brown hair. And they both use the same voice actor as Zog, so they all sound really similar. So if Yog or Zog with an X were puppeting Freckles, the voice would make sense. Not to mention, someone somewhere had to be helping Dagmar from the inside of Dreamland. The country of Meru, where Dagmar is from, had this notorious reputation for dark magic, so even the most simpleton of leaders is going to be wary to have their family marry into that. There has to be somebody pulling strings to make things happen. And I have this sneaking suspicion that it was Zog with an X. Yog and Zog were his children, and Yog was the golden child and heir to the throne, but Yog was already with Oona. Dagmar had to marry the spare, not the heir. However, to be able to create a queen, she would have to clear the lineage pathway before Yog had any children, and oddly enough, Yog ends up poisoned shortly after becoming the king of Dreamland, which would also mean that Yog's father had to already be gone. So, what if Zog with an X made this deal with Meru to create a magical alliance, and then he ended up getting double-crossed? Once Zog and Dagmar got married, Zog with an X was just a pawn in the way of Dagmar's chessboard. So the father-in-law had to go. And being this hateful, self-centered man, which is how Zog describes his father, Zog with an X could have been enchanted, manipulated, or even gently persuaded to go another route other than death. So if given the option, maybe inhabiting Freckles and biding his time to be a useful piece on the board is what Zog with an X chose to do, or got forced into doing. Now I grant you that does feel like a stretch, but we know so little about Zog with an X. Actually, aside from King Zog's flashbacks, all we know is that Zog with an X had his page torn out of the Book of Dreamland Kings, and there was mysterious ancient writing scribbled on the page. And that writing supposedly mentioned the Og family curse and some big war that they were a part of. But then the leaders were listed alphabetically in that book, so why tear out the name that starts with an X instead of an A or a Z? So for whatever reason, Zog with an X is already particularly associated to curses and magic, which between that, the voice, and the general appearance of Freckles, it really makes me think that Zog with an X might be the one piloting that body. But I guess we'll have to wait for Part 5 to find out more. Oh, and I want to point out this other detail too. In Part 3 of Disenchantment, when King Zog first gets Freckles and he's talking through the puppet, or at least we think that's what's happening, the word dinky is used, which is a very unusual word. We don't hear that word very often. And then in Part 4, when Freckles is sentient and he can move all by himself, he leans over to Becky and Cloyd in human form and tells them to get dinky. I mean, sure, dinky is a word that we can all recognize, but it is not common enough to be used by two different people that readily. So I believe that when Zog said the word dinky, it was actually Freckles talking through him instead of the other way around. Details support theories. Yeah! But go in the comments and you guys let me know what you think about all of this. It might not be reality, but theories are more fun. I did a video on who Elfo's mother was, and heck yes, I have to give my brain credit. I gotta give this one credit to the power of my brain. I'd say that was a victory for my powers to brain. Oddly, nobody can recognize her voice, but that's oddly nobody really recognizes her face or her yeah, that's 100% Dagmar selling that doy. Well, family members, we're almost done, but I want to invite you to hang out with me in some other places. I'm on Twitter and Instagram as my own personal self, and I have a Facebook page too, but I mostly just post photos over there. And sometimes people say, "Hey McGann, I want to mail you something. How do I do that?" Easy. Just click the About tab on my channel page, and my most current P.O. Box info will be right there. I also run another channel, The Family. It's really a hodgepodge channel where we might post anything. Oh yeah, and I also sell shirts and stickers and stuff with the Family and the Fangirl logos. If that is your cup of tea, I have a link in every description of every video. Finally, if you want to help out the Fangirl channel and make sure I'm putting out video essays for years to come, the best way you can help is by subscribing and watching more of my videos, whether they're new, old, whatever. Maybe even share one or two on social media, help spread the word. People who watch to the end of videos like you helps to tell the site, hey, this is a good video, we should recommend it to other people. So if you made it this far, leave me a comment of something like, hey, I made it to the end. Love ya. See you next time, family members. Bye.